Let's do Aristotle. Today, we're talking about book 10. Last book of the IX&X. Let's do a brief recap. So we have book 1. We get an articulation of what eudaimonia is. Our eudaimonia is the chief good, and it is the end of all human pursuits. It is that which is self-sufficient and ultimately end-like. Book 2, we get introduced to the moral virtues and a discussion of the doctrine of the mean. Book 3, we'll split it in two. Book 3a, or 3 alpha, is a discussion of choice and deliberation. As it relates to the moral virtues. Remember that our moral virtues are inculcated via habituation, whereas the intellectual virtues are inculcated via education. Book 3b, the latter half of book 3, all the way to book 5 are applications of the moral virtues. So Aristotle is going to apply this conceptual framework and articulate some of the moral virtues. He does not provide an exhaustive list. He merely provides discussion of some of them. Book 5 is a discussion of justice. We get a discussion of bravery, as well as discussion of magnanimity in there. Then we get book 6. Is a discussion of the intellectual virtues, which are inculcated via education, and we have 5 of them. It is an exhaustive list, unlike the moral virtues. Book 7 is a discussion of pleasure. Book 8 is a discussion of kinds of people and acrasia. And book 9 we had a discussion of friendship. And now book 10, the final bit of the IX&X. We're going to get a discussion of pleasure and 3 different kinds of lives. This discussion of 3 different kinds of lives correlates to the discussion on the same topic that Aristotle has in book 1 of the Ethics. It just gets fleshed out here in greater detail. So, we'll take a peek at this. If you recall, in book 1, when Aristotle is trying to understand what is eudaimonia, so we have this essential question of what is eudaimonia. Well, before we even get to what eudaimonia is, what is the chief good? We're trying to understand what is the chief good, or the telos, the end, the purpose, the goal of human life. And Aristotle says that Aristotle starts with a supposition that whatever people commonly pursue, there has to be something there. It may not be a full understanding of what is correct, but it's a good starting place. Okay? So, Aristotle identifies 3 different kinds of lives that people lead. People lead the life of contemplate. Let's articulate this. There's the life of pleasure. There's the life of political activity. And then there's the life of contemplation. And it's in one of these three that the chief good, which we ultimately learn is eudaimonia, is supposed to reside. Okay. Aristotle very quickly excludes the life of pleasure, because pleasure is, while not bad, is the kind of thing that animals are capable of experiencing. As such, it cannot be where we find human eudaimonia or human flourishing, because it is a shared capacity. And Aristotle kind of hems and haws between life of political activity, or what he calls the life of honor, or in Greek, life of time, and contemplation. He ultimately excludes the life of honor because he says that honor is externally located. What it is to be honorable has, to some degree, is not fully dependent upon the individual, but what it is to be honorable is dependent, at least in part, on the perception of others. And then we get this life of contemplation. This is here in book 1. Now, by the time we get to book 10, we're going to revisit these three lives. And we're going to look at them in greater detail. So life 1 is pleasure. Life 2 is the political life. And then life 3 is the contemplative life. Okay. Now, the life of pleasure, Aristotle is still going to agree with his earlier claim that pleasure is not the human good. It's not the end of human life. Why? Because we do experience, it's a shared capacity with animals. But that doesn't mean that pleasure plays no role in the good life. In the life that is eudaimon, pleasure is a supervening phenomenon. We can think of pleasure as kind of like that which completes the good life. Okay. Aristotle thinks that the pleasure is going to be the completing piece. It's the icing on the cake, so to speak, of the good life. The good life, the life that is eudaimon, the life that instantiates proper human function, is incredibly pleasant. But remember, when it comes to pleasure, we had a distinction here between what I called, on the one hand, genuine pleasure, and on the other hand, pseudo-pleasure. Pseudo-pleasures are demarcated by a physical sensation. So that sensation, for example, of drinking water on a hot day, that pleasant feeling that you feel in your throat and in your mouth, that is, in Aristotle's mind, not genuine pleasure. Genuine pleasure comes with proper functioning. Okay. He uses the example of a hunting dog. A hunting dog experiences pleasure when it smells a rabbit. Why? Because hunting dogs are, what it is to be a hunting dog, the totienai, the essence of a hunting dog, is to be the kind of thing that is a dog that is designed or bred to hunt game. Okay? So the same way the hunting dog experiences pleasure when it smells a rabbit, this is what Aristotle has in mind as genuine pleasure. It is only achieved when the organism is functioning properly. So in our case as human beings, we experience genuine pleasure when we instantiate our capacities for rational self-governance and for understanding. So the pleasure that you experience, not necessarily feel, because it's not felt, but it's experienced, the pleasure that you experience when you finally solve your math homework after it's been challenging, that pride and pleasure that you experience of figuring it out, that is genuine pleasure. The pride or the pleasure, we think of it a lot of times as pride, but the pleasure that you experience when you hold to your diet, or when you do the good thing, you do the charitable thing perhaps, or the kind thing, or the brave thing, that pleasure that you experience, this in Aristotle's understanding is genuine pleasure. So note that pseudo-pleasure is demarcated by a physical sensation. Think of it as smiley face happiness, okay? Whereas genuine pleasure, it's understood in terms of proper functioning, but it is deep-seated. It is a psychological pleasure. It is being pleased that, in contemporary philosophical language, we may think of this as an affective state. Okay? It is understood in terms of language. It is understood in terms of what is going on in the mind of the agent. Whereas physical or pseudo pleasures are demarcated solely by physical sensation. Okay? Now, Aristotle thinks that the life of eudaimonia, the life that the phronimos is experiencing, that it is being eudaimon, it is genuinely pleasant. That is, the phronimos, person who has eudaimonia, is constantly experiencing deep-seated or psychological pleasure. If you recall earlier, when we were looking for the chief good, we said there are two conditions. It must be self-sufficient. That is, it is the kind of thing that once it's possessed, makes no sense to desire something else. And it is ultimately end-like. That is, it's the thing that when it is attained, you can't want anything else. There's no extra step. So remember I used this example of trying to differentiate between intrinsic versus instrumental good. To say, why do you want money? You want money because it buys you things. Why do you want those things? Because it makes you happy. I ask you, why do you want to be happy? And you look at me weird because it's a stupid question. Why do you want to be happy? Because happiness is ultimately end-like. In identifying these two necessary and jointly sufficient criteria for the chief good, which we learned was eudaimonia, in identifying these, where's it going? We incorporate pleasure here. Aristotle manages to incorporate pleasure because it's a natural objection. If you say, look, what it is to be eudaimon is some kind of life of contemplation or some kind of political life, one could very easily think, well, what about pleasure? Don't we want pleasure in our lives? If we do want pleasure in our life, then the life that Aristotle articulates of eudaimonia is not self-sufficient. Why? Because there is something else you could reasonably desire. This is in part why Aristotle thinks that the life of eudaimonia has to contain pleasure. It has to contain pleasure because without it, the kind of life that he has articulated is not self-sufficient. But now that it's been incorporated as a deep-seated psychological happiness, not as smiley face happiness, now that pleasure's been incorporated, it is self-sufficient, this life. Okay? So, there is something to the life of pleasure. Aristotle thinks that while the person who's pursuing pleasure as a telos, as an end, is misguided, they have failed to understand what the end of human life is. In some sense, they are using a heuristic. They are trying to figure out what the end of human life is, but they've gotten distracted by pleasure. And they have a fundamental misunderstanding of what pleasure is. Why? Because they're guided by sensation, and they're not guided by proper function. Well, this then leads us to the life of contemplation and the political life, the life of civic engagement, we may think. Aristotle, he's very clear here. He's clear in one sense, and he's not clear in another sense. The contemplative life is the best kind of human life. Okay? This is the best life that a person could live. Let's flesh out this contemplative life. The contemplative life is fulfilled through exercising rational self-governance, and understanding our distinctive human capacities. Because we are doing these things well, this kind of life is pleasant. Moreover, in this kind of life, we have friends, and our friends are a way in which we can exercise our moral virtues. In many ways, Aristotle conceives of virtue friends or virtue friendship as two people of similar virtue kind of competing and outdoing one another in terms of virtue. So they are competing not in an unproductive competitive sense, but in a way of making each other better, kind of like an iron sharpened iron kind of concept. They are competing to do the bravest thing, to do the most temperate, to be most magnanimous, to be kindest. And it's a way for them to push one another and a way for them to exercise these moral virtues. Another thing that the life of contemplation has is it has leisure. Aristotle writes in other works called the Metaphysics. This is what we call it in English. In Greek, it had no title, but when it was placed at the Library of Alexandria, it was titled. It was placed after the work called the Physics, or in Greek, ta phusike, the work on nature, and the book right after it was always referred to as metaphysicae, or after the physics. This is where we get the word metaphysics. It's a very interesting work. It's an amalgamation of different thoughts and different concepts, talking about part-whole relationships, talking about understanding and essence and all this kinds of fun stuff. But the metaphysics begins in book 1 with this really iconic opening line. In this, Aristotle says that philosophy began in Egypt. You're thinking, well, why is philosophy beginning in Egypt? He says philosophy began in Egypt because the Egyptians were the first ones to have leisure time. Leisure time is time that does not have to be spent on productivity. It is time when one has sufficient levels of wealth, one is able to take some time not focusing on subsistence. But if you're constantly focusing on survival, you don't have time for leisure. And Aristotle thinks that it's only with this leisure time that we can start thinking about life more abstractly. If you're constantly hungry and trying to keep you and your kids alive, you're not thinking about what makes a good human life. You're just trying to not die, okay? But when you have enough wealth and enough resources that you don't have to think about, where is my next meal coming from? Is my child going to eat today? Then you have time to think about life more abstractly. And Aristotle says this first begins in Egypt. So this component of leisure, I take it, is central to the life of contemplation. It is because the contemplative person or the person who's pursuing a life of contemplation has enough resources that she can devote her time to thinking about this. Now note, the contemplative life is not some weird recluse hanging out in the ivory tower. It is, if I had to imagine the life of contemplation in a very contemporary landscape, it's like the most idealized version of graduate school. It is where people have enough resources, which is very unlike graduate school, so it's a very idealized version of graduate school. It's people who have enough resources that they can devote their time toward thinking about life abstractly. And they exercise these moral virtues because it is intrinsically good. Okay. I would say undergrad, but I've been to undergrad. There's a whole lot of wasted leisure time that's involved in your undergraduate life, that a lot of that gets kind of weeded out in grad school. So Aristotle's very clear. This is the best kind of life, the life of contemplation. But this isn't the life we all get to lead. In books or chapters 7 and 8, I believe it is, or 8 and 9, not 7, I believe it's 7 and 8, Aristotle is going to discuss the political life. Now, the first thing you need to understand, when Aristotle says the political life, he's not talking about what we think about. We live in a horrible political landscape. Aristotle does not think of the political life as whatever goes on Fox News and CNN. Okay? He doesn't think of it that way. The political life is a life of civic engagement. It's a life spent interacting with others. Okay? And the political life, in many ways, is a life of production. It is, quote unquote, the real world, where you have to interact with people and make a living, and do all these kinds of things. The kinds of things that the person who has the life of contemplation, with sufficient time for leisure, because they have sufficient resources, doesn't have to worry about. So this is the political life. And Aristotle says that the goal of the legislator the goal of the legislator is to make good people. Remember, good here, I know I'm already getting like horror style cringes of contemporary political landscape and the imposing of virtues or like moral concepts onto people. This is not what Aristotle's doing at all. The legislator, the person who is involved in the political life, their job is to get people properly functioning, to get them to be rationally self-governant, and to get them to have and exercise understanding. Remember, our two kinds of virtues, we have the moral virtue, which is cultivated via habituation. And then we have the intellectual virtue, which is cultivated via education. The legislator is investing into these two things. So the ideal legislator, in Aristotle's mind, is heavily invested in education. Why? Because education is the only way that we exercise our intellectual virtues. The ideal legislator is pushing for better math programs in schools, Why? Because when we do mathematics, we get to exercise our intellectual capacities for nous, for episteme, and for Sophia. We get to do all these things, 3 of the 5 of the intellectual virtues, we get to do when we do math. So the legislator is focused on things like math. Okay? They're also focused on habituation, so mentorship style, where they push ideas of how to be temperate, how to be brave, how to be magnanimous. But remember, we said about the moral virtues that they are not cookie cutter. It is not one size fits all. It is not the case that a brave action for agent A looks the same as for agent B. We said that the moral virtues are they are the mean between 2 vices, one of excess and one of deficiency, relative to the individual as the person of practical wisdom, the phronomos, would determine it. So, what the legislator is trying to do with the moral virtues is, yes, bravery is good for all of us. Magnanimity is good for all of us, insofar as it instantiates proper functioning. But what it looks like is different for everyone. And the legislator, the ideal legislator in Aristotle's mind, helps people figure that out. The ideal legislator, her job is to help people figure out, what does brave action look like for little Timmy? Okay? So this political life, it resembles nothing what goes on today. It is very much a life of civic engagement and making people better. Okay? Now, in many ways, and we're going to get there in less than 5 weeks, this is why I decided to do Plato's Republic instead of John Rawls's Theory of Justice. One, I just like Plato more, sorry. But in addition to that, in the Republic, Plato is going to introduce an idea of the philosopher king. And part of the job of the philosopher king, Plato articulates, is to drag people, by force if necessary, into understanding. Their job is to make people better. Okay? Aristotle, in many ways, is picking up on this idea of the philosopher king. He doesn't go as far with it as Plato does. Plato gets a little crazy at times in the Republic. You'll read it. You'll find out Plato's kind of crazy ideas, like the noble lie and whatnot. But Aristotle's picking up on this idea that the end, the telos of legislation is the well-being, the eudaimonia of others. Okay? Political life is not supposed to be selfish. It's supposed to be outward-looking, where you're focused on making other people flourish. Now, as a result, in order to lead the political life successfully, one must already possess eudaimonia. One must be eudaimon. And this comes straight from Plato as well. The philosopher king is flourishing, and she uses her flourishing to drag others into flourishing as well, into eudaimonia. Aristotle says that his work here is not complete. We're almost done here. So we have this text of the Nicomachean Ethics. And in many ways, this is part 1. Because the goal of the Nicomachean Ethics, it's a treatise on eudaimonia. It's a treatise on human flourishing. The Nicomachean Ethics is focused on the individual. How do I flourish? What do I need to do to live well? But the funny thing about human beings, Aristotle's very clear about this, is we're social creatures. We don't live alone. Human beings do not ever settle by themselves. As a species, we settle in groups. We We settle in a polis, in a city, in a conglomeration of people. So part 2 is another work that Aristotle writes called the Politics. And the goal of the Politics is not how does the individual experience eudaimonia, because we accomplished that in the IX&X ethics. It's how does the polis, how does the group, how does society, how do they experience eudaimonia? And how does the legislator get them to experience eudaimonia? Aristotle's Politics is in many ways a further fleshing out of certain books of Plato's Republic. Okay. Aristotle thinks that if you're going to be in charge of the people, if you're going to be a legislator, and if you're going to do this well, one, you must be experiencing eudaimonia yourself. And on top of that, your goal better not be yourself. Your goal better be the flourishing and the success of others. Now, it looks different for everyone. We're going to read this when we talk about Plato. Plato's going to think, hey, look, some people are born for certain roles. Sounds really hard. Plato's going to have something called the noble lie in the Republic. And he's going to say, look, we're going to tell people from birth that they were born with a certain kind of metal inside them. Those that were born with bronze, all they can ever do in life is be producers, artisans, okay? Those with silver, their job is to be the guardians of the Callipolis, of the beautiful city. And then those born with gold are to be the philosopher kings. They're the rulers of the city. So what it looks like, this is Platonic thought, not necessarily Aristotelian, what it looks like for a cobbler, a shoemaker, to flourish practically looks very different than what it looks like for a guardian of the city to flourish, which looks different from what a philosopher king's flourishing life looks like. So while the individual representations of flourishing may differ, it is still the job of the legislator in Aristotle's mind to get everyone toward eudaimonia. Okay? Because it's not enough that the individual flourish. We want the group or the society to flourish. All right, let's go ahead and pause there.